On April 28, 1988, at around 1 p.m., a sunny day in Hawaii set the perfect scene for Aloha Airlines Flight 243 to take off. The passengers, most of them excited holiday-goers, were eager to enjoy the stunning beauty of Hawaii, a tropical paradise of islands nestled in the Pacific Ocean and a proud part of America. This short 35-minute journey was a routine hop from Hilo, the southernmost island, to Honolulu, Hawaii's vibrant capital. Aloha Airlines, known for connecting these picturesque islands, operated flights like this daily. The aircraft for Flight 243 had already completed 8 trips that morning, typical for short-haul planes in the region. Everything seemed normal as passengers boarded and the doors were secured. At exactly 1:25 p.m., the flight took off, leaving behind the scenic runway of Hilo. Yet one small detail carried ominous weight. While boarding, a passenger noticed something odd, a tiny crack in one of the plane's riveted sheets. Believing it insignificant, she said nothing. After all, Aloha Airlines was reputable, and the planes were assumed to be meticulously inspected. Surely this was no cause for concern, but fate had other plans. About 10 minutes into the flight, the air hostesses rolled out the drink trolleys. The seatbelt signs remained on, as the plane had yet to reach its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. Everything seemed routine until 20 minutes after takeoff, the plane hit its cruising height. Then it happened. A thunderous bang echoed through the cabin. The plane had suffered rapid decompression. The once calm atmosphere erupted into chaos. Oxygen thinned. Breathing became a struggle. What had begun as a sunny island hop was now a nightmare at 24,000 feet. Things went flying all around. Total chaos and terrible confusion. No one could understand what was happening. Some passengers looked around and saw that the plane's roof and surrounding walls were missing. They could see the sky above them. What happened was that about 35 square miles of the front of the plane's body had disintegrated and blown away. What usually happens is that the air is always pressurized in cabins in a plane, so that we can breathe normally. Otherwise, at a height of 24,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure is very low. The air is so thin that we cannot breathe normally at that height. That is why airplanes have their own pressurization system, which regulates the air by pumping it. If for some reason this system breaks down and the airplane keeps flying at the same altitude, then in case of this emergency, those oxygen masks will drop down. You must have heard about this in the safety briefings. In the event of loss of cabin pressure, oxygen masks will drop. These oxygen masks typically contain an oxygen supply for about 15-20 minutes, during which time the pilot has to get the plane to descend to an altitude where people can breathe normally, at a height below 10,000 feet. Now in our story, what happened in Flight 243 is that the oxygen mask did drop, but the oxygen mask system was not working. Due to the plane's roof being blown away, the oxygen mask system was completely destroyed. People were concerned about hypoxia, the condition in which if your body does not get sufficient oxygen, you can get unconscious and eventually lose your life. Within seconds, people started feeling dizzy and confused. In such cases, it takes only 1 to 2 minutes to lose consciousness. Michelle Honda, an air hostess, was near row 15 during the explosion. She tried contacting the cockpit through the intercom, but there was no response from the other side. The second air hostess, CB Lansing, was serving a drink to a passenger near row 5. When the roof of the plane blew apart, she went flying out of the plane. Their third colleague, Jane Sato, was near row 2. She fell to the floor after being hit by a flying luggage. There was commotion all around. When Michelle didn't get any answer from the pilots, she went to each and every passenger to ask if they knew how to fly a plane. This scared the passengers further. They were being asked to fly the plane. This made them wonder about the pilots. Without trained pilots, they were doomed to crash. She reached near the cockpit by crawling on the floor. There she saw her colleague Jane's head was bleeding. When she tried to look inside the cockpit, she couldn't see anything. The cockpit's view was completely blocked. There were only a few precious minutes after which all of them would lose consciousness and EE. But apart from hypoxia, these passengers had to bear strong winds. Winds as fast as nearly 500 km/h speed were blowing at them. It was difficult to keep their eyes open, and the temperature was at minus 45 degrees Celsius at this height. Even if there was oxygen supply somehow, It wasn't possible to survive long in that cold, because most of the passengers were wearing shorts and t-shirts. Hawaii is a tropical place where people go to see beaches and jungles. There is no snow here, so no passenger was prepared for this temperature. Michelle was the only air hostess in her senses. She kept trying to contact the pilots. "Can anyone hear me?" But there was no answer. Among all these dangers, the good news was that the pilots were actually alive. And not just alive, the pilots were in much better condition than the passengers. Their oxygen masks were thankfully working. 44-year-old Captain Robert Schamsteimer was in command, a highly experienced pilot working for Aloha Airlines for 11 years. With him was the 36-year-old First Officer, Mimi Tompkins. When the explosion happened, both of them felt the shock. And when they turned around to see, they saw that the plane's roof was missing as well as the cockpit door. There was debris all around, but both of them immediately got to work. First of all, they wore their oxygen masks, and considering the situation, they decided to go for an emergency descent. They flew the plane at the speed for 500 km per hour and descended at a speed of 4,100 feet per minute. But the time constraint wasn't only for the descent of the plane. They had to face another problem, bigger than this. It was found that due to this incident, the nose of the plane, the front part in which they were sitting, was drooping down a bit, only by about 1 meter. The floor of the plane was the only thing holding the cockpit and cabin together. If they kept flying so for a long time, the two parts might break apart. Mimi Tompkins contacted Honolulu and informed them about their situation. They were told to land the plane in Maui instead of Honolulu, since it was closer. At 1:48 p.m., she contacted Maui Tower and informed them about the situation. It was about 3 minutes since the plane's roof had flown away, but thankfully the plane was at 14,000 feet. At this height, it wasn't difficult for most passengers to breathe. And since it had descended within 3 minutes, most people didn't lose their consciousness, and at least the risk of hypoxia was over. Mimi Tompkins contacted Maui Airport and told them to keep all emergency services ready. Anything could happen. Firefighters and rescue vehicles were at standby on the runway. Everyone was waiting for this plane to land. A minute later, the plane had reached the height of 10,000 feet. When another problem arose, there was a 10,000-foot mountain in front of them, the Haleakala summit. This mountain was between the plane and Maui Airport. Captain Roberts slowed down the plane. 210 knots, 200 knots, 170 knots. They keep slowing down. They fly it as slowly as possible. Any slower and it would be difficult to control the flight. Maintaining the speed of 170 knots, they navigate the plane between two islands. The plane evades the mountain and turns towards the airport. At this point, the passengers could understand the situation better. They finally realized that the plane was flown by a pilot. Not only was the pilot alive, but he was flying the plane expertly. As the plane went towards the runway, Mimi Tompkins deployed the landing gear. There should be 3 sets of wheels, 2 on the rear and 1 on the front. The ones at the rear are called the main gear. The indicators showed that the main gear was successfully released. But the nose gear, the wheels at the front, weren't releasing properly. Now, technically speaking, it is possible to land without the front wheels, the nose gear. This is known as belly landing, and it is done during emergency cases. But in this specific case where the middle portion of the plane was so weak and the roof was already missing, the pilots were afraid to attempt a belly landing because then the plane would crash definitely. And if something happened to the fuel tank, there could even be a blast. But there was no other option. There was nothing else they could do. The pilots decided to attempt landing like that. As soon as the runway was visible, the passengers were holding on for the landing. Some started praying. Others were hugging the people around them. This could very well be the last time they saw each other. Most of the passengers were still terribly scared, all for a justified reason. As the plane descended, it had started moving side to side. The pilots realized that their left engine had failed. They tried to manually restart the engine, but unfortunately, they couldn't restart it. By this time, the emergency services were prepared on the runway. Firefighters, ambulances, evacuation teams, everyone was preparing for the worst situation, trying to minimize the damage. At 1:56 p.m., the pilots informed the Maui Tower that they will need all the equipment the airport had. Meanwhile, a person on the runway was tracking the plane with binoculars. That's when he spotted that the nose gear was successfully released. The plane didn't need belly landing, they informed the pilots. One less thing for the pilots to worry about. Then, at 1:58 p.m., exactly 13 minutes and 42 seconds after the explosion, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 touched down on the runway. Apart from using the brakes, the captains used the thrust reverser of the remaining engine. Gradually, the plane came to a halt safely. The emergency teams present on the runway breathed a sign of relief. The passengers were deboarded from the plane through the emergency exit. There's a real video of this, which you can see on the screen. You can see the passengers safely sliding down. The passengers applaud the captain and thanked him for saving their lives. Although most of them were safe, many of them were seriously injured. An 84-year-old female passenger who was sitting on seat 5A had a skull fracture and suffered the most injuries. The passenger sitting in 6A suffered a broken hand. The passengers in 4A and 4F were seriously injured. Basically, most of the passengers in rows 4 to 7 were seriously injured because the roof of this area had blown apart, and the passengers in rows 8 to 21 were only minorly injured. Apart from this, there were 21 passengers who weren't injured at all. Air hostess Jane Sato remained unconscious. She suffered only a concussion. Air hostess Michelle Honda was safe, and after landing, she counted the number of passengers to check whether any of them were missing. And it turned out that miraculously, everyone was safe and alive except for one. 58-year-old air hostess CB Lansing was the only one who passed away in this incident. Search teams tried to find her later, but unfortunately, her body couldn't be found. She disappeared into the depths of the sea forever, and the remaining 94 people were grateful to have survived. Was it mere luck that they survived? No. The credit goes to the technical equipment. I am talking about the seat belts, the biggest reason why so many people could survive. As I told you in the beginning, because this flight hadn't reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign was still on and people were wearing their seatbelts. Had the people sitting in rows 4 to 8 hadn't worn their seatbelts, they too would have flown out of the plane. After this incident, as this news spread, the photos of this plane were published in newspapers globally. A miracle flight without a roof. After this, America's National Transportation Safety Board sent a team of investigators to investigate this incident, to find the cause of this incident. The investigation team found that this plane had completed 89,680 flight cycles and 35,496 flight hours. The fuselage of this plane, the main body of the plane, was weakened due to fatigue and corrosion. Every time the plane was in the air, the metal sheets on it expanded due to the pressurized cabin, and when it was on the ground, the fuselage contracted. This constant cycle of expansion and contraction made it weak. This was a Boeing 737 plane whose fuselage is made of aluminum sheet metal panels arranged circumferentially in a frame. Each panel overlaps each other by 3 inches, and the overlapping area is called the lap joint. Because the thickness of these sheets was only 1 millimeter apart, Boeing developed a bonding process to allow the skin to absorb stress like a single unit. The company used a strong glue called epoxy to join the different parts of the plane. When this glue dried, a strong bond developed to distribute the stress in all the plates and to prevent any cracks. Glue wasn't the only way to keep these sheets together. In addition to the strong bond of glue, there were 3 rows of rivets on every overlap. The overlapping parts of every sheet was riveted together so that the entire frame of the airplane could be secured. Boeing's first batch of 737 airplanes used this method to join the sheets. But later on, problems arose due to using this method. They found that when the moisture content in the air was high, the bonds became weaker. The epoxy glue started degrading and the metal started corroding. This meant that the stress on these sheets were borne by the rivets instead of the glue. Because of this problem in 1972, Boeing decided to use a new method of attaching these sheets together. They started using hot bonding. It uses heat and pressure to attach 2 sheets together. Friends, interestingly, this hot bonding system was already being used since 1972, and the Aloha Airlines Flight 243 incident happened 16 years later. So this airline was blamed for still using the old airplane. Boeing had issued a service bulletin in 1972 stating the issue with their planes and possible problems it may cause. In fact, in 1987, 1 year before this incident, Boeing issued an alert service bulletin that their older planes should be inspected and repaired properly in case any airline was still using them. Apart from this, Boeing had a safety design stating that in case of a tear in the fuselage, it needed to be limited to a 10-inch by 10-inch square. They had placed tear straps at every 25 centimeters of the plane's body, so that even if any part of the plane's body tore, the tear wouldn't spread to the rest of the body. But the Flight 243's condition was so terrible that there were numerous cracks across it. So many cracks that these tear straps weren't really useful. The National Transportation Safety Board revealed that when this flight reached cruising altitude, the cabin pressure surged to its peak, causing individual cracks to converge. The result? A catastrophic failure that ripped apart an entire section of the roof. The NTSB's final report outlined 3 critical factors behind this disaster. First, Aloha Airlines management failed to properly supervise its maintenance program, neglecting thorough inspections and quality controls. Second, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration shared some blame. Despite Boeing's recommendations for rigorous joint inspections, the FAA didn't require them while issuing the Airworthiness Directive. Although the FAA did instruct Aloha Airlines to adopt advanced testing methods, like the eddy current technique, where electric currents detect even microscopic cracks, Aloha Airlines falsely claimed compliance. It later emerged they hadn't inspected their planes properly. Third, the failure to address issues with an outdated bonding technique reflected poorly on both Boeing and the FAA. Boeing had designed its 737 to last 20 years, with a service life of 51,000 flight hours, or 75,000 flight cycles. While Flight 243 hadn't surpassed its flight hours, it had exceeded 90,000 cycles, far beyond Boeing's recommended limit. This excessive wear, combined with its age, contributed to the tragedy. But this disaster wasn't in vain. It became a turning point for global aviation safety. A fleet-wide inspection of Boeing's older planes uncovered similar cracks, proving this wasn't an isolated issue. In response, safety protocols tightened worldwide. The FAA launched its Aging Aircraft Safety Program in 1991, mandating stringent inspections and maintenance for older planes. Techniques like eddy current and ultrasonic testing replaced reliance on the human eye, ensuring cracks are detected early. High-cycle aircraft, like those used for frequent short-haul flights, now face more rigorous inspection schedules. The tragedy also spurred legislative action. The Aviation Safety Research Act of 1988 set the stage for understanding and addressing aging aircraft issues more effectively. This single incident reshaped aviation safety forever. Since then, incidents of this scale have become extraordinarily rare, thanks to enhanced technology and stricter regulations. Yet it also reminds us of the critical importance of applying even the most basic concepts of safety and diligence.